People were so passionate that even when we offered to let them remain anonymous or stay off the record, some of them said, no, attach my name to it. I don't care. This is how I feel. Sorry for the delay in Rhode Island Part 2. We shot Rhode Island 1 and Rhode Island 2 at the same time, and then we aired Rhode Island 1, and what we didn't expect was the amount of feedback and actual testimonials from people who work and live in Rhode Island and were in the system at the time that the events in Part 1 happened. We didn't expect that, and we had to redo Part 2 because of it, because we felt like it would really paint another incomplete picture on top of an already incomplete picture if we didn't include some of the sentiment that was relayed to us. People were so passionate that even when we offered to let them remain anonymous or stay off the record, some of them said, no, attach my name to it. I don't care. This is how I feel. We're not going to do that because we don't feel it adds any value, for one, and two, none of the information really rises to the level of being objective. Most of it's subjective. But that said, it's still important because we do feel that, especially what we're going to talk about in this episode, when we're talking about reactions from the EMS community in Rhode Island to what happened in Part 1, we feel it actually puts the responses from the EMS community into a lot of context that was missing from the original article. So let's recap about what we talked about in Part 1. In Part 1, we brought an article to your attention that was published late 2019. Now, many of you probably actually recall this article. What the article talked about was several unrecognized esophageal intubations that were discovered by Dr. Nick Aslan. Now, it ended up being 11 esophageal intubations that were unrecognized. And of those unrecognized 11 esophageal intubations, it was determined that 8 of them were done by EMT cardiacs, with only 1 of them being done by a paramedic. The remaining 2 were not known. Now, if you need to really understand the significance of all that, go back and watch Part 1. I'm not going to go over it again here. But what we talked about in Part 1 was that while the EMS community at large basically took that to mean that these EMT cardiacs in Rhode Island shouldn't be allowed to intubate, we felt that the article did not provide enough information and really omitted some absolutely key points about that data that paints an entirely different picture. The main point being is that while it seems like the ratio is off with all of these unrecognized esophageal intubations being done by EMT cardiacs, as it turns out, Rhode Island is one of the few states that has a substantial higher ratio of intermediary level, like the EMT cardiac, to paramedics. In fact, most states have EMTs being the largest group, with paramedics being the second largest group, and the intermediary levels, like EMT advanced or EMT cardiac, being a very, very small group. In Rhode Island, it's substantially different. The EMT cardiac is actually the most abundant certification in Rhode Island, and it's not by a small margin. In fact, it's more than a 4-to-1 ratio of EMT cardiacs to paramedics, so it's no wonder that data shows that if there are missed esophageal intubations going on, the EMT cardiacs are probably just more likely going to end up being the ones that place them just purely because there's more of them, not necessarily because they're worse than paramedics and shouldn't be allowed to intubate. So we talked about why that was, and we talked about some other issues we saw in terms of documentation standards and not necessarily either appropriately documenting or using better confirmation standards. So in this episode, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about what happened next. You see, after Dr. Aslan made these discoveries, he went on to make some proposals to Rhode Island's Ambulance Service Advisory Board. We're going to talk about the proposals he made, what happened at that meeting, the response to his proposals at that meeting, which is, oh man, it's the stuff of legend. But unlike the article, we're actually going to talk about some things that occurred outside of that meeting prior to it that may have set the stage for such a response. And also, we're going to talk about some other conflict of interest that really weren't mentioned in the article that may shed some light as to why the Rhode Island EMS community and the Ambulance Service Advisory Board responded the way that they did. But to be fair, we're also going to put our thoughts behind Dr. Nick Aslan's proposals and some positives that could have come from them if they were adopted. Spoiler alert, one of them was not adopted. And by the way, we might not say what you think we're going to say, so watch for that. Also, we're going to have to talk about a 12th unrecognized intubation that occurred shortly after this meeting and these proposals were made to the Rhode Island Ambulance Service Advisory Board. And this time the proposal is followed up with state investigation and lots of widespread attention, two things that were definitely lacking from the previous 11 unrecognized esophageal intubations. And then finally, we're going to wrap this up with why we did this whole series in the first place, why revisit this old article. We'll talk about what has changed in Rhode Island EMS since the article was published in terms of protocols. And finally, I'm going to give you my closing thoughts as to what this means to us as an EMS community nationally and even internationally, now that we finally really know what the happened in Rhode Island. All right, guys, but before we go too far along into part 2, please remember to like this video if, of course, you like it, and subscribe if you want to see more of it. Those are two little things that go a long way in not only helping us to continue to make free content for YouTube, but it also helps bring you the EMS 2020 podcast and all of it completely for free. If you haven't heard of our podcast, by the way, that's really how we got started. So check out EMS 20/20 wherever you listen to podcasts and let us know what you think. We review medical calls that were done in the field, and we see if we can't learn something from them. Also, if you have anything you want to say about our content, please do so in the comments. That also helps tweak the algorithm a little bit in our favor. So with that, let's get into it. So let's talk about that meeting at the Ambulance Service Advisory Board. Now, what exactly is the Ambulance Service Advisory Board? Let's start there. So the Ambulance Service Advisory Board is a board in Rhode Island that is technically advisory in its role to the state of Rhode Island. This board handles everything from determining what the protocols are to disciplinary actions towards providers. Now, while it's technically advisory to the state, based on quotes from state officials in the article talking about how they don't really have enough time to go after everything that comes by, and based on what we've heard from people who called us who work in Rhode Island, the state isn't exactly over-resourced, let's say. So things that you may be used to seeing states or counties do, the Rhode Island Ambulance Service Advisory Board actually handle. So it's important that if you want to make change, like Dr. Aslan did, that you get the Ambulance Service Advisory Board on board. So in order to do that, Dr. Nick Aslan attended a meeting of the Ambulance Service Advisory Board in Rhode Island in March of 2019. Now, in March of 2019, he made two proposals. The basic gist of the proposal was that responders were to try less invasive methods of airway management, such as a BIAD, which was a term I didn't know. Apparently it's blindly inserted airway device, what many people would call an SGA, or supraglottic airway device, before attempting intubation. And that proposal actually passed with a substantial majority. The second proposal that Dr. Aslan made did not pass. Dr. Aslan's second proposal was to limit the practice of intubation just to Rhode Island paramedics, taking the practice away from EMT cardiacs. That proposal did not pass, and it was instead deferred to a subcommittee of the Ambulance Service Advisory Board that meets to evaluate and modify Rhode Island protocols. However, this subcommittee would not meet or evaluate Dr. Aslan's proposal until February the following year. So essentially, at least until February, which is almost a year away from this meeting in March of 2019, Dr. Aslan's proposal was dead right there. Now, that's really not the important part of the story. What many people were talking about after they were done falsely accusing EMT cardiacs of being the cause was not just the Ambulance Service Advisory Board's response, but also the EMS community that was present at that meeting. You see, the article painted the picture of this meeting as being an abnormally packed room for such a meeting, and that was confirmed by several people who messaged us who were actually at that meeting. The article has several quotes from the meeting in response. In fact, one person who was in attendance was Mayor Joseph Policina. Now, the mayor was a retired firefighter and EMT cardiac themselves, and he was quoted as saying, "The EMT cardiacs are under full-scale attack" during the meeting, which is quite the statement. He's also quoted in the article as making some other statements prior to this meeting. There was a meeting prior to this one where physicians tried to more closely define the role of physician oversight in Rhode Island and medical directors, and he is quoted as saying something along the lines of, "I might as well just hand the keys of the city over to you and you can run the whole thing." I'm paraphrasing here. During the meeting, Mayor Policina also described intubation as a life-saving tool, urging the board to not restrict the practice. According to the article, he viewed this restriction as a punishment that shouldn't occur due to a few misses, and that if anything, more training is the answer, not restriction. A firefighters union representative that was present at the meeting is also quoted as saying, We're the experts, not doctors who are doing it when they're in nice ORs or nice ERs with bright lights and a lot of people helping them, which according to the article apparently drew applause. So the article described Dr. Nick Aslan's proposal as drawing swift fire, but it's actually this part of the article that drew my attention to the possibility that there may be a context problem when it comes to the number of missed esophageal intubations that went unrecognized and the providers that did them. You see, it wasn't until this part of the article, some 18 paragraphs after the article mentions the ratio of EMT cardiacs to paramedics when it comes to unrecognized gut tubes, that the article makes mention of the 4-to-1 ratio, and it does so in a fashion that I at least found it really easy to miss. See, it only mentions it when quoting a firefighter who talks about how many of the EMT cardiacs are more experienced than the paramedics. They had been around longer and maybe have done more intubation. It's only at that point that the 4-to-1 ratio is mentioned, and then it is never mentioned again. And I have to admit that frustrated me a little bit. And while I'm sure my frustration was not the intent of the author, however unintentional that was, it was still an unrecognized enumeration placement.
No shock.
Enumeration's counting, but that's the best I
mean, essentially, yes.
I laugh. According to the article, there were follow-up interviews with Mayor Policina in which he talked about how he feels some board members have an agenda that involves moving EMS over to private companies and reducing the role of EMT cardiacs. Now, that's not what I'd call an ideal portrayal of any meeting. It's hard for me, as someone who has been in EMS now for a long time, to really condone or look forward to any kind of saber-rattling statements. They never really seem to help, and rarely have I ever seen any good action come from statements like that. And if anything, all it does is draw a thicker line between sides, and that's usually never helpful. It's really never how you move forward. That being said, though, is the portrayal of the meeting in the article accurate? And if it is there some justification for it? Or at least some context that might make the response make at least some kind of sense. As far as the accuracy goes, it's anyone's guess. Information we got from people who called us said that, yeah, it was a heated meeting, but at the same time, we were able to find meeting minutes from follow-up meetings of the Rhode Island Ambulance Service Advisory Board in which they talked about getting a stenographer. Mayor Policina actually is the one who brings up hiring a stenographer to record how everything goes in the meeting, which I think we can safely say means that at least some people felt that they were not accurately represented by the article. But if we want to bolster the article's portrayal, we can actually just look at the meeting minutes from the very meeting the article attempts to portray, in which there is an entry that says, "Discussion ensued in great length from the board and the public." So while that's kind of vague, it does at least indicate that there was substantial discussion about it. Now, all that aside, let's talk a little bit about, is it justified? Because like I said, I rarely see statements and discourse like this lead to anything positive. People usually have to calm down before anything's done. That being said, I know there's many people out there, and maybe I'm included in this group. Sometimes you just have to chuck a brick through a window. Maybe that's what they felt like they were doing. After all, let's try and look at it from their perspective. As we mentioned in part 1, it really isn't fair to lay this at the fault of EMT cardiacs. But what was Dr. Nick Aslan's second proposal? Limit the practice of intubation to just paramedics, taking it away from EMT cardiacs. Now, presuming the data the article linked is accurate, it's data the article says was compiled by Dr. Aslan and presented to the board at the meeting. That data did not support laying the blame at EMT cardiacs. So when we reflect back at Mayor Policina's statement of the EMT cardiacs under a full-scale attack, while I still feel that's overly dramatic and unhelpful, at the same time, I can kind of see how someone would feel that way when presented with a proposal that's backed by data that doesn't back it. It does kind of seem like EMT cardiacs are being targeted. And this is also probably a good time that we need to bring up more of the conversations that we had with people who live and work in Rhode Island and were at this meeting. You see, the history between this board and Lifespan, who owns several hospitals in Rhode Island, and Brown University, both of which Dr. Aslan worked for, is much longer and more complex than this article even attempted, nor should it have attempted, to fully capture. This absolutely was not the first run-in, and I'm sure it wasn't the last after this. You see, there are members of the Rhode Island EMS community that feel there's a strong conflict of interest when it comes to a physician or any physician from either Lifespan or Brown University having control over what EMT cardiacs and paramedics or EMTs are allowed to do because they have something to gain. Specifically, if EMT cardiac's role was reduced, the state would then need more paramedics. The state needs more paramedics, then more training and education is needed, something that Brown University could potentially provide. Now, we went and looked, and we could not find any paramedic program that Brown University is currently providing, though they do provide other EMS training services. Paramedic wasn't one of them that we could find. If you know different, please let us know and we'll amend the video. But let's revisit the proposal again. Now, I want to make it very clear. I do not have any additional knowledge as to why Dr. Nick Aslan made this proposal, but I think it's fair to assume that people felt he was blaming the EMT cardiac. But there are other valid reasons to control the number of providers that are able to intubate. Look, both Spencer and I, and if you don't know who Spencer is, check out our podcast, both Spencer and I agree that intubation can be very, very helpful in the field. Both of us have done it and we've had a lot of success with it in our careers. And there are programs out there that are very, very successful at intubation. But something I will also say, without hesitation, is that if you're going to allow your providers to intubate, you absolutely have to support it. And that means training. It means a really good QA/QI process. It means really good equipment, not just end-tidal capnography, but video laryngoscopy, which if you don't know what that is, that's essentially a laryngoscope, which is what you use to visualize the trachea for placing the tube, that has a camera on the end. They're devices that have shown to increase the success rate when they get deployed. There are several programs around the country that have incredible first-pass success rates, which is exactly what it sounds. It's the rate at which a patient is successfully intubated on the very first attempt. But a lot of these programs have a lot of things in common, and they're the things I just mentioned. Incredible QA/QI processes. They limit the group to a small number of people who receive specialized and consistent training. Programs that employ those kinds of things are the most successful in the nation. That's not to say you can't be successful without those things. But I will say it's probably harder, and you're riding on maybe a little bit of luck. And we really don't want to ride on luck when it comes to intubation, so I'm always a big proponent of training. So it could be that Dr. Nick Aslan's proposal was more centered around controlling the number of providers who are allowed to intubate and establishing best practices. But that wasn't mentioned in the article. It was not in the data that was provided allegedly by Dr. Nick Aslan to the ASAB, so it's just a guess on my part. Now, we can't conclude part 2 without talking about one last thing. Just a few days after the March 2019 meeting where Dr. Nick Aslan made his proposals due to a number of unrecognized esophageal intubations, there was a 911 call. It was a 911 call for a cardiac arrest patient. EMS responders showed up, started CPR, and started running a code. A tube was placed, and by the time they arrived to the emergency room, it was discovered that the tube was indeed no longer in the trachea. There was no documentation of end-tidal capnography being used, which if you saw part 1, that's really important. And it was placed by an EMT cardiac. Now, I want to point out something. Even adding this additional unrecognized esophageal intubation to the EMT cardiac side of the equation doesn't suddenly move that statistic into any sort of relevancy. It's still irrelevant. It's still a tiny sample size. It still in no way backs up the assertion that EMT cardiacs are the problem when it comes to these things. But the timing could not have been worse. As a result, in this case, the state did a full-on investigation. Ultimately, the state did not take the EMT cardiac's license away, but they did essentially place the EMT cardiac on what you could probably describe as certificational thin ice. As far as we could tell, the EMT cardiac involved remains an EMT cardiac to this day and is still practicing. And I want to be clear, that's not our statement or some snide way of saying that they shouldn't. We weren't there and we don't truly know everything that happened. Now, the article does link to a consent that the EMT cardiac signed, stating that they did not use end-tidal capnography, or that they didn't even attempt to use end-tidal capnography when placing the tube. And that went against protocol. I'm not sure why the EMT cardiac had to sign a consent. This could be something about Rhode Island that does things differently, but we should also mention something else to also be fair. The article makes mention of 2 other factors. One, that the receiving physician noted gastric distension, which if you watch the first part, you would know that that means air has been pushed into the stomach. In other words, the tube was in the wrong place and not pushing air into the lungs. Also, the patient's brother was on scene. And while the patient's brother never became a full-on certified EMT, he did state to the article that he at one point drove an ambulance. And he stated, after the fact, that he also felt that he noted gastric distension on scene, but didn't think much of it at the time because he was too distraught. If that was the case, then that would indicate that the tube was misplaced the entire time. So where are we at now? How have Rhode Island protocols changed? Well, Dr. Nick Aslan's first proposal of limiting intubation in Code 99 patients, only to be used after other less invasive measures have been attempted, is still in. EMT cardiacs are still allowed to intubate, though the protocols now contain writing in several places that absolutely mandate the use of continuous end-tidal waveform capnography and also clarify the exact things that need to be charted and when. It also states that when available, the end-tidal capnography file from the device, which some devices do record it to a file, must be uploaded and attached digitally to the chart so that the actual data can be reviewed at any time. And these are great standards to have. Also, I want to commend Rhode Island's protocol. It's really well organized and it's like a clickable PDF and it's chef's kiss stuff. It's nice. But one of the things that was also pointed out to us, again, by people in Rhode Island, is that while intubation remains in the protocol, if you look at the actual treatment protocols, the point at which intubation is suggested or mandated by the protocol is actually kind of rare, requiring patient conditions to kind of thread the needle, if you will, to where the protocols recommend intubation. One person stated that was a gradual change that began after the article was released, though I do not have any older versions of the protocol to confirm that. All right, so that is what happened in Rhode Island. So why did we do this piece in the first place? Why did we dig up some old history and just rile a bunch of people up? Well, we really felt it was important that we got the right message from the article. Make no mistake, unrecognized esophageal intubations are not good. And it doesn't matter who placed them. It has to be addressed. And the article is correct when it says that that should be a never event. Those who are in charge of training need to swoop in and adjust. Changes need to be made. Stones need to be turned over. We have to figure out how these things are occurring. It's important. But we found that the message the community took away was the wrong one. And in part one, we back up why we feel this was the message that was taken away. There are articles written both in JEMS and on lawyers' websites and on web forums where people are just lambasting these EMT cardiacs, pointing at them as the cause over and over again. JEMS wrote an article. The Journal of Emergency Medical Services wrote an article highlighting the faults of the EMT cardiacs over these events. And that's wrong. Because if you believe that these are problems that can only happen to this subset group of EMTs that are unique to Rhode Island, then you might mistakenly believe that it can't happen to you as a paramedic in some other state. It can, and it does happen. Indeed, the worst thing we could have taken away from this was exactly what we took away from it, and that was, it's not me, it's somebody else. It's not. It's all of us. So while the initial training between a paramedic and an EMT cardiac may appear significant, it won't matter if you stop there because you feel that it was enough to save you from the shortcomings we spoke of in this series. We are privileged to be able to perform these advanced interventions to help people, but the job isn't about doing cool things. It is about helping people. But our license to be able to do these interventions should be based on their ability to improve or save lives and nothing else. If we turn our back to our vulnerabilities because we believe it can't happen to us, then it's our vulnerabilities that will take this privilege away, as it rightfully should. Consistent advanced training, a robust and transparent QA/QI process, and good equipment has been what has stood between success and failure for many agencies who successfully employ this tool. So my hope is that when you look and read that article, which you should, we see not an isolated incident that can only happen to one set of people, but rather a warning to us as an EMS community, so that we can continue to be able to use advanced tools and interventions to actually help people, now that we know what the happened. As always, everyone, thanks for watching. Go ahead and hit like if you liked it. Please subscribe, that absolutely helps us out. If you have anything to say about it, let us know down in the comments. Don't forget to check out the EMS 2020 podcast, where me and my co-host Spencer Oliver review calls that actually occurred in the field and see if we can learn something from them. And with that, we'll see you. All right, so thanks again. I don't know how to end these.